The purpose of this lecture is to examine the argument that the Italian campaign was Normandy's long right flank, a strategic initiative that diverted scarce German resources, especially fighter aircraft and high-quality infantry and armored divisions, away from the Eastern Front in 1943 and France in 1944. We first need to recognize that the initial decision to invade Sicily in the summer of 1943 was made at the Casablanca Conference as an alternative to the invasion of France in 1943. The Casablanca Directive declared that the reasons for occupying Sicily were to secure the lines of communication through the Mediterranean, the sea lanes, diverting German pressure from the Eastern Front, intensifying pressure on Italy to surrender, and encouraging Turkey to enter the war as an active ally, a particular focus of Winston Churchill's. Plans for the invasion of France were now confined to maintaining a small mobile force in the United Kingdom, which in the words of the Casablanca Directive was to be, quote, in constant readiness to re-enter the continent as soon as German resistance is weakened to the required extent. The context for this emergency operation was the catastrophe overtaking the German army at Stalingrad and the possibility of an end to the war in 1943. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, began on 10 July and ended on 17 August. Historians disagree over the nature of the Allied achievement in Husky, and you will find information on this debate in the resources section. But for our purposes, what matters is that the relatively rapid conquest of the island meant that when the Allied leaders met in Quebec City during August 1943, they authorized actions to eliminate Italy from the war by the invasion of the mainland, the establishment of air bases to bomb southern Germany and the Romanian oil fields in Italy, maintaining unremitting pressure on German forces in northern Italy to assist the Allied campaign in northwest Europe, which was now scheduled for 1944. Operations against southern France and support for anti-Axis forces in the Balkans were also discussed. There was agreement, firm agreement apparently, that Operation Overlord was to be the primary ground and air effort against the Axis powers in 1944. Formal agreement on priorities for 1944 was confirmed at the Tehran Conference when pressure from Stalin helped to ensure that the British and Americans agreed on the timing of Overlord, then thought to be May 1944, and a commitment to Anvil, the invasion of the south of France. The apparent agreement between the big three masked basic differences of opinion about the value of the Italian campaign. Throughout 1943 and 44, the British saw opportunities everywhere in Italy and the Balkans, which the Americans resisted as threats to the future of Overlord. After the Italian surrender and the Allied occupation of southern Italy, American strategists would have been satisfied with air bases on the Foggia Plain and continuous operations against the German forces defending central and northern Italy. But unrelenting pressure from Churchill and the British Chiefs of Staff led to a series of battles that continued into 1945. The war in the Mediterranean certainly added to the proportion of war production, air power, and manpower directed against the Western Allies from 1943 to the end of the war. For example, in simple numerical terms, the Germans sacrificed 125,000 men in Tunisia, and had committed 195,000 additional men to the defense of Italy before Operation Husky began in July 1943. That number rose steadily. On April 1st, 1944, the German total was close to 400,000 men. A year later, April 1945, Army Group C in Italy had almost 600,000 men on strength. These totals are exclusive of German forces committed to Greece and the Balkans, a proportion of whom were present there to forestall or defeat an Allied crossing of the Adriatic. One reason that Germany was willing to maintain such large forces in the Mediterranean after 1943 was the role northern Italy played in the German war economy. The industries of Turin and Milan, together with the agriculture of the lowland plains, became more important assets with the shrinking of German economic space in the east. This, together with Hitler's irrational commitment to Mussolini, his oldest ally, are the basic realities of any overview of what happened in Italy. The Luftwaffe also committed significant resources to the Mediterranean. As Williamson Murray has shown, German aircraft losses in July 1943, when the Wehrmacht was engaged in the Battle of Kursk-Orel, were 40% higher in the Mediterranean than on the Eastern Front. The key questions for students of grand strategy is how much Allied effort was actually required to hold a significant level of Axis forces in Italy. Major General Sir William Jackson, the British official historian, uses divisional comparisons to argue that the Italian campaign succeeded as a holding action because after August 1944, the Germans committed more divisions to Italy than the Allies did. The Canadian official historian, Colonel G.W.L. Nicholson, accepts this ratio of divisions, but adds that, quote, throughout 1944, the total strength of the Allied forces in Italy continued to exceed 1.5 million. So who was fighting the holding action? The 1.5 million figure is only part of the story. The total commitment of Allied forces, men and women, to the Mediterranean theater in 1944 was over 2 million. All of them had to be fed and clothed using resources shipped from North America or Great Britain. Many of them had to be armed. Very large numbers were hospitalized at some point during 1944, due largely to diseases such as malaria, not military action. Neuropsychiatric casualties, battle exhaustion, or combat fatigue as the Americans called it, also raises some interesting questions. As always, caution should be employed in citing numbers because so much depends, as it does today with post-traumatic stress disorder, on who is making the diagnosis. Nevertheless, there is strong evidence that the toll of such casualties was much higher in Italy than Northwest Europe or indeed anywhere else in the Second World War. The figures for the British Army, 30 per thousand, are double the number when we analyze 1944 figures for Northwest Europe. American numbers show a similar pattern, and it appears that the incidence of disabling psychiatric illness continued to plague a disproportionate number of soldiers in Italy in and out of combat until the last days of the war. The related problem of absence without leave and desertion also needs to be integrated into accounts of the campaign. Always a serious problem in Italy, it reached crisis proportions in the winter of 1944, when deserters and absentees in the British Army averaged 1,000 men a month. More than 5,000 British soldiers were serving sentences for desertion in 1944, and the numbers for 5th U.S. Army were similar. Most such offenses occurred in anticipation of action against the enemy, meaning soldiers took off after they learned their formation would be returning to the front lines. Staying with numbers, it appears that casualty rates between nations require further study. Existing accounts do not really explain why Americans incurred 36% of all casualties, while British, as distinct from Empire Commonwealth losses, totaled 29.1%. Indeed, when the French Expeditionary Corps numbers are added, 5th U.S. Army appears to have endured about the same number of casualties as all British and Commonwealth forces combined. Within 8th Army, the Canadians, New Zealanders, Indians, and Poles account for fully 40% of the casualties of the Italian campaign. One might explain this by noting that on average just 30% of British troops served within the combat zone, but we then must consider the significance of having more than 300,000 British soldiers serving behind the rear divisional boundaries in Italy, particularly when in 1944, British divisions were forced to reduce their establishments by 1/3. A total of more than 92,000 Canadians served in Italy. Of these, more than 5,000 lost their lives and 19,000 were wounded. A further 1,000 became prisoners of war, and 365 died from causes other than war. Expressed as a percentage, this means that almost 1/3 of the Canadians who served in Italy became casualties of war, not counting those who were evacuated for battle exhaustion. The number of Canadians labeled as neuropsychiatric casualties in Italy was exceptionally high, with more than 5,000 individuals so designated during the 17 months of the campaign. This means that 1 in 5 non-fatal casualties was evacuated for battle exhaustion, with much higher rates in periods of intense combat. These ratios that I've outlined for the Canadians apply to all of the Allied armies that fought in Normandy. It is apparent, then, that there is still much to be learned about the campaign in Italy before final judgments can be made. We will look more closely at operations in Italy in a future lecture, focusing on the trade-off between the Anzio landings and the postponement of Anvil, the invasion of the south of France, which was originally scheduled to take place in June of 1944.